Welcome back to Unfair Housing. Thanks for joining us this week to dive into our discussion on school segregation and its relationship to housing. As a reminder, we have several episodes available that cover the housing climate from post-Civil War through the pre-civil rights eras. If you missed any of our previous conversations on these topics, I recommend checking those out. Today, we'll take a look at the influence of the housing industry on schools and vice versa. We'll build on the topics covered in prior episodes to explore the connection between these practices and the location and racial makeup of schools throughout the U.S. As always, please remember this podcast is not meant to be an exhaustive discussion on housing segregation, but rather an opportunity to look more closely at the neighborhoods around us. Also, we welcome lively discussion on the topics we raise, but we ask that you exercise kindness and consideration when making and responding to comments. Okay, let's get into it. As we discussed in prior episodes, the Reconstruction-era constitutional amendments, specifically the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, effectively made former enslaved people citizens of the United States, with all rights afforded to natural-born citizens. However, many of the federal and state programs we have discussed took liberties to chip away at the rights afforded to the formerly enslaved, or prevent them from being realized at all during the 1870s. This included the school systems. Black Americans, finding little justice in their own communities, took to the court system to restore many of the rights they were entitled to under the Constitution. At times, though, these efforts weren't successful at providing justice either. Think back to the prologue episode and episode 3, where Alicia discussed the 1896 case Plessy v. Ferguson. The decision in Plessy upheld a Louisiana state law that prohibited Black travelers from riding in a train car designated for white travelers. The court decision in Plessy not only agreed the law was constitutional as written, but per the National Archive, it also allowed for equal but separate accommodations for white and colored races. While Plessy specifically dealt with separate railroad cars, it was that same decision and doctrine that allowed segregation in all aspects of American life, including in schools. The case was a landmark decision that upheld the constitutional basis for racial segregation and led, in large part, to the Jim Crow era. As a reminder, Plessy remained the law for nearly 60 years. During Plessy's era of separate but equal, communities were segregated into Black and white neighborhoods. Redlining, a term we discussed in depth in episode 4, was implemented to reinforce these neighborhood divisions. And where neighborhoods were segregated, the local schools in those neighborhoods were separated into white and Black too. Black schools were often underfunded, located in older, unsafe buildings, inaccessible by public transportation, and supplies and textbooks were generally limited and used. Further, Black teachers were typically paid a fraction of what white teachers were paid at white schools, yet they did the same work, or arguably more work, as they were required to do more with less. A local example of an all-Black school in Central Florida that was able to achieve academic success despite their disadvantages is Jones High School in Orlando, Florida. Jones High School was established in 1882 as a private academy for Black students in Orlando. By 1950, the school occupied a building on Washington and Paramore Streets, but students knew not to cross the train tracks into the business district after dark. Jones High School was a product of the separate but equal doctrine under Plessy, but likely would not consider their school experience as equal to that of the white Orlando High School nearby. Students at Jones High School had to use broken desks, out-of-date textbooks, and damaged athletic equipment. Jones High School would remain segregated until 1953, but faculty there would ensure academic success of future leaders such as Orange County Mayor Jerry Demings, Dr. Sylvester James Gates Jr., PhD in mathematics from MIT, Judge Eleanor Mitchell Hunter, Orange County judge and the first African-American member of the Florida State University College of Law moot court team, and Florida State Senator Gary Siplin. But school segregation was not just an accidental byproduct of separate but equal. In many cases, it was also a tool used to keep neighborhoods separate. The city of Austin is an example of a city built to reinforce segregation. After discriminatory zoning laws were struck down in 1917, the city of Austin tried to draw Black Americans to Black neighborhoods by designating all Black public services such as parks, housing, and schools on the east side of town. They believed this would force Black people to move to the segregated neighborhoods on the east side of town, and they were right. They even referred to this as the Negro District. In the 1930s, Black Austin residents would live throughout the city, but within a decade, they were all on the east side of town. The red-lined all-Black part of the city was physically solidified when Interstate 35 was constructed in the 1960s, right through the divided area. Recognizing the importance of education, as well as the inherently unequal treatment Black Americans were experiencing throughout the U.S., the NAACP, led by Charles Hamilton Houston, began to mount a legal defense to the separate but equal doctrine. It would be nearly 50 years after the Plessy decision before the U.S. Supreme Court would hear Brown versus Board of Education and overturn the doctrine of separate but equal, understanding that separate was not equal. So let's talk about Brown versus Board of Education. The United States Supreme Court famously heard the Brown case in 1954. Brown is actually a collection of several school segregation claims in Topeka, Kansas, which included the 1951 case of Oliver Brown, whose daughter was denied admittance to a white school in Topeka and was instead forced to ride a bus much farther to the all-Black school. Brown joined with other families in Topeka to form a class action that reached the Supreme Court. The Browns, along with the other families represented in Brown versus Board of Education, were represented by the NAACP, including prominent attorneys Charles Hamilton Houston and Thurgood Marshall. In addition, the Brown plaintiffs relied on the work of Dr. Kenneth and Dr. Mamie Clark, a husband and wife psychology team who studied the psychological impact of segregation on Black children. The Clarks were the first Black Americans to obtain doctoral degrees in psychology from Columbia University in 1946 and became famous for their experiments demonstrating that Black children began to identify Blackness with bad and whiteness with good. These experiments and the Clarks' research were used in the NAACP's case against segregation and ultimately swayed the Supreme Court's ruling that the doctrine of separate but equal was unconstitutional. The Clarks were influential during the civil rights movement themselves and offered testimony in several cases on school desegregation. Their casework focused on the impact of segregation on children, and they opened the first Child Development Center, Northside Center for Child Development, in Harlem in 1946. Mamie Phipps began studying child self-perception during her doctoral studies, which would later help develop the Clarks' famous doll experiment used in the Brown case. She met Kenneth Clark during her studies, who helped expand her thesis. The Clarks' experiment used 4 dolls, identical but for the color of their skin, and Black children were asked questions about their perceptions of the dolls. The Black children largely attributed positive qualities to the white dolls and negative qualities to the Black dolls. The Clarks concluded that the psychological impact of segregation resulted in Black children perceiving themselves negatively. This landmark research would go on to help support desegregation efforts across the country. While the Supreme Court ultimately ruled that school segregation should end, it left a wide gap in how and when that should occur, stating segregation must end with all deliberate speed. This left states and localities with the duty of determining when and how segregation in schools should actually end. Unfortunately, all deliberate speed would mean decades for some students as Southern states and local governments resisted the integration of schools. Thanks for listening so far. We'll take a quick break, and when we return, we'll get into the shortcomings of Brown and how the decision, coupled with a second Supreme Court case related to school busing, impacted housing.
Hey folks, Alicia here again. We hope you're enjoying the Unfair Housing podcast so far. Thank you for joining us, and remember, if you or someone you know is experiencing housing discrimination, or if you would like to schedule a fair housing training, contact our Fair Housing Unit at 800-875-8785. That's 800-875-8785. To see if you qualify for other legal assistance, contact the CLS helpline at 800-405-1417. That's 800-405-1417. Don't forget, give us a like and a follow, and please share the series with your friends and family. Also, be sure to follow CLS on Instagram, Facebook, and X.
Welcome back. Before the break, we discussed the Supreme Court decisions in Plessy v. Ferguson and the landmark case of Brown v. Board of Education that overturned Plessy. But what does all this have to do with housing? Well, at this time, integration of schools could only be achieved through intentional measures by local governments because neighborhood segregation and redlining caused the location of schools to be within neighborhoods of one race. Up to this point, school assignments were largely based on the proximity of the school to a student's home to ensure that Black students exclusively attended Black schools in their neighborhoods. If a Black student did, however, happen to live closer to a white school, then the school district would require that the student travel to the nearest Black school. The state of Virginia's response to Brown demonstrates the Southern attitude regarding school desegregation. In 1956, 2 years after the Supreme Court ended school segregation in Brown, the Virginia legislature voted to close public schools rather than integrate. In January of that year, Virginian voters passed a referendum to provide grants to students to allow them to attend private schools. These grants would benefit white students only. The grants would be reviewed by a 3-man pupil review board, which would later be called a veiled attempt to continue to segregate on the basis of race. By August 1956, the Virginia General Assembly voted to close any public school that had been ordered to integrate, which resulted in 1,800 Black students being left without formal education offerings. This would start a large-scale political effort of massive resistance in the South. As part of the Southern Resistance Campaign, 101 Southern politicians would sign the Southern Manifesto condemning the Brown decision, stating that it encroached on states' rights. The manifesto did not cause massive resistance to integration, but formalized the Southern states' response to it. The manifesto declared that the signatory politicians could use any lawful means necessary to reverse what they deemed unconstitutional decisions by the Supreme Court. And as their authority to limit the Supreme Court's reach to the states, they relied heavily on the 10th Amendment. The 10th Amendment states powers not given to the federal government or withheld from the states are powers reserved for states or the people. The Southern resistance to school integration would have a lasting impact on the implementation of the Brown decision. By 1968, nearly 15 years after the decision in Brown, about 77% of Black students and 55% of Latino students still attended public schools that were more than half minority. This was due in large part to neighborhood segregation. To accomplish school segregation requirements and account for housing segregation complications, many jurisdictions implemented busing as a way to integrate Black students into white schools and white students into Black schools. Initially, these busing programs were entered into voluntarily by jurisdictions seeking to uphold the decision in Brown. However, a challenge to the busing programs was heard by the U.S. Supreme Court in 1971 in the case of Swan versus Charlotte Mecklenburg Board of Education. In this case, Darius and Vera Swan wanted their son to attend an integrated school, but were denied access to the school and told to stay in their neighborhood school, which was a Black segregated school. The U.S. Supreme Court ultimately held that the Charlotte Mecklenburg School District would have to come up with a plan to end segregation. This resulted in an increase in busing programs across the country. Following the Swan decision, the Supreme Court limited their own ruling a few years later in Milliken versus Bradley, decided in 1974. The Milliken decision held that busing could only be implemented if it could be shown a school district had created policies that contributed to segregation in the first place. This limitation would further white resistance to integration, as white people would begin to use this loophole to argue against forced busing and rely on arguments of individual choice rather than segregation policies. Meaning, opponents of segregation would argue that Black people chose to go to segregated schools and not that the school district policies required it. By the early 1980s, busing policies, largely unsuccessful to this point, would begin to disappear. As we'll discuss next week, busing programs implemented following the Brown decision helped convince white people to relocate their homes and some schools entirely, which would result in more segregation, not less. The development of voucher programs to allow white students to transfer to private or charter schools also ensured that integrated public schools would eventually become predominantly Black. Nearly 70 years after Brown, and more than 50 years after Swan, students are more segregated than ever. Today, nearly 7,000 schools in the U.S. have a Black student population of less than 1%. On the flip side, 74% of Black students and 80% of Latino students attend public schools that have mostly minority students enrolled. Further, a survey by the U.S. Government Accountability Office concluded the 2020-2021 school year had the highest percentage of schools serving a single race or ethnic group since the 60s and 70s. As the courts begin to intervene on race-based discriminations, we see private citizens take matters into their own hands. Segregationists would argue against the infringement of their freedoms to be forced to integrate, and civil rights activists would argue against their unequal treatment under the law. The result? White people begin to take their families and their money out of the cities and into the suburbs, and urban areas would begin to decline. We'll see you next week as we continue to dive deeper into housing segregation practices and their outcomes. Thanks for joining us this week. We hope you enjoyed today's episode, and if so, give us a like, and don't forget to follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and X. Please also subscribe to the podcast so you always know when new episodes are released, and leave us a comment and share our information with your friends and families. We look forward to having you back next week. We'll see you then.